Sophia, thank you for that very warm introduction. Really appreciate it and hope I can live up to it. It is an absolute thrill and an honor to be here in Halifax with you all. Thank you so much for this invitation. And it's also an honor to follow my esteemed colleagues and friends, Ethan and Indy, who I've had the opportunity to work with, and am thrilled to be able to build on some of their ideas. So I'd like to change the energy for just a moment and take the first few minutes, given that this is an Art of City Building conference, to introduce a new art form called Songlines. I won't sing, don't worry. But really, the intention behind what I want to speak with you about today is how can we raise expectations of what our cities can be? How can we raise our expectations about what Halifax can be? So that's really informing my thinking a lot these days, and it's also informing what I want to discuss with you this morning. So the songline that I want to share with you. So songlines are actually, they're in Australian Aboriginal culture. They are both metaphoric and physical creation storylines that run across the landscape and provide a way of understanding the stories over time of geographical and of sacred sites. And Leonie Sandercock, the great postmodernist city planner and filmmaker and a mentor of mine, wrote in one of her books, Cosmopolis 2, she wrote this city songline. And by the way, I'm also going to gift a book to the library because I would like to be reading from the physical book, but this library doesn't have it, so I'm going to gift it. So just before I read this, and it will take a few minutes, what I'd like you to imagine is that we have a fire, a nice fire in the center here. Take a couple of deep breaths, and if you like, even close your eyes while I read this city songline, and try to imagine not only where Leonie would have been writing this from Los Angeles, probably 15 years ago or so now, but also perhaps to imagine what you dream of for your city. Here goes. I look into my crystal globe, and I dream of the carnival of the multicultural city. I don't want a city where everything stays the same and everyone is afraid of change. I don't want a city where young African Americans have to sell drugs to make a living, or Thai women are imprisoned in sweatshops in the garment district where they work 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. I don't want a city where I'm afraid to go out alone at night or to visit certain neighborhoods even in broad daylight, where pedestrians are immediately suspect and the homeless always harassed. I don't want a city where the elderly are irrelevant and youth is a problem to be solved by more control. I dream of a city of bread and festivals where those who don't have the bread aren't excluded from the carnival. I dream of a city in which action grows out of knowledge and understanding, where you haven't got it made until you can help others to get where you are and beyond, where social justice is more prized than a balanced budget, and where I have the right to my surroundings, as do all my fellow citizens, where we don't exist for the city, but are seduced by it, where scarcity doesn't build a barbed wire fence around carefully guarded inequalities, and where no one flaunts their authority and no one is without authority. I want a city where people can cartwheel across pedestrian crossings without being arrested for playfulness, where everyone can paint the sidewalks and address passersby without fear of being shot, where there are places of stimulus and places of meditation, where there's music in public squares and street performers don't have to have a portfolio and a permit, and street vendors coexist with shopkeepers. I want a city where people take pleasure in shaping and caring for their environment and are encouraged to do so, where neighbors plant bok choy and taro and broad beans in community gardens. I want a city that is run differently from an accounting firm, where planners plan by negotiating desires and fears, mediating memories and hopes, and facilitating change and transformation. So Leonie calls that her love song for the city. And it's really about naming existing narratives and expressing desired ones. And it's really about reconciling dreams and aspirations with expectations. So yes, we have to dream and we have to imagine much bigger, but we also have to expect much more. We have to get more rigorous. We have to work together differently, which I'll talk about a little bit later, in order to achieve these grand aspirations. So I want to talk about one way of looking at change, one way of looking at how we can achieve the kind of transformation that we need. And this is just one way of looking at change that we do in our Cities for People work. And that is based on a hypothesis that possibilities for positive transformation open up to cities that, that think and act in these ways. And the first bubble is about learning to collectively listen and make sense collectively so that we can have much more effective collective action. We're always focused on collective action, but the argument is that that would actually be much more effective if we learned how to listen much better to each other. The second bubble in the lower right is about identifying and really valuing in our practices and policies over and over, deliberately and relentlessly, what are the core values, what is it that we share. It might be around reconciliation, innovation, resilience, inclusion, etc. And then third is making possibilities visible. So back to what Ethan was just presenting. Making all of this visible in space, in tangible space, experimenting with regulatory changes, experimenting with work on the ground, with making and sharing spaces through networks, really writing new narratives about what cities can be. So I just want to say a few words about the McConnell Foundation where I work. So the McConnell Foundation, for those who don't know it, it's a private family foundation. We have a pan-Canadian mandate. We're based in Montreal but work across the country. And we are really about creating a culture of social innovation and building a more inclusive and resilient society in very engaging ways with civil society, with all sectors, and with the public. And our work is quite focused right now on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, very much aligned with that, and really gearing ourselves up and working with a range of multi-sectoral partners on what Indy was talking about with respect to the great transition that is ahead of us. So our initiatives are primarily around Indigenous reconciliation, around social innovation, social entrepreneurship in universities, as well as youth and childhood mental health, food systems, energy and economy, and cities. And our main two cities initiatives are Cities for People and Future Cities Canada. So one of the things that we've been quite focused on, especially recently, is something that the federal government created a co-creation steering group last year, and our CEO, Stephen Huttard, was a member of this, and they recently put out the Social Innovation and Social Finance Strategy. And I invite you to have a look at this because there's a way for all of us to engage in this. This is, again, it's about creating a culture of social innovation, but also creating the mechanism, the social finance funds, the networks in cities across the country to continue growing our social finance ecosystems so that we can build what we need to for this great transition ahead. So a couple of the strategy questions we're asking ourselves is how can we create better equality in cities, and also that we need to go beyond sustainability. How can we move beyond it to be regenerative in the way that we develop our cities for the long term? So I just want to give a few examples of our work and also some of the things that we're inspired by. So an example is We Are Cities. And We Are Cities was a listening process. I talked about collective listening, collective sense-making. This was something we supported a few years ago now, which was a civic engagement process across the country. It was led by our partner Evergreen, based in Toronto, but we had conveners throughout the country, including here in Halifax. The Ecology Action Centre led a series of roundtables that many of you hopefully were involved in. And so what we heard through this process was that after talking with thousands of people across the country about what they expected from their cities, there were really 5 key themes that came out of it. And those are in the lower left, which were around equality, concerns about equality in all its forms, the commons, seeing the city as a commons, data, concerns about data, which we'll talk about in a couple talks a little bit later. Obviously a growing concern for all sorts of reasons in our world right now. Urban indigenous issues and opportunities, as well as future-proofing. So what does community resilience, what does disaster resilience need to look like as we plan for our cities over the next, over the coming decades and even centuries for that matter? So TJ already said something about Canadian placemaking, but I just want to add to that the Canadian placemaking work over here came out of really our thinking around this city as a commons. And we ended up connecting with Ethan and Project for Public Spaces, but that movement was actually led by groups here in Halifax, and I'm sure that some of you were involved with that. Sophia, who introduced me, had an idea that there are all kinds of fantastic innovations around the country, but they're not well connected, they're not having enough impact, and they might not even be identifying themselves as placemakers or connected to a broader movement. And we can actually have much greater impact if we work together. And so she and others, she and her partner Greg, undertook a study. We had a placemaking lab, and it's grown, and it's built on itself, and now we have a whole kind of self-organizing group across the country. This is how these movements of change really need to be built, from organic grassroots efforts. So I want to turn now to a little bit of our thinking and work around civic assets, what we call civic assets in the Civic Commons. So by civic assets, we're talking about places like this. So libraries, schools, churches, public spaces, parks. And they're the assets in our communities which have been strategically located and very important in the past, but in many cases, are either underused or disused and could provide much better community serving needs. So in many cases, these are just huge latent value in these assets that we're not realizing. At the same time, we have so many needs that also aren't being met. So there needs to be a much better match and much more strategic thinking in how we address those. So the Civic Commons is really where we do together what we can't do alone. So this is the backbone of the city. And Ethan, in his last talk, referred to Saskia Sassen. You know, in one of her recent talks, her provocation was, who owns the city? And it's funny because that's such an obvious question in a way, but it's something that we don't often think of or ask ourselves. And if the answer to it is actually that we all do, then that has huge implications, actually, for how we think about the city. Indy talked about land value and other kinds of value, and rethinking fundamentally how we place value on land, on intangibles, also on data assets as they're growing. So as we think about who owns the city and how we can see the city as a commons for collective resource sharing is a huge question for our future. So Sheila Foster is one of the great prolific writers on this right now. She and also Christian Ioni, who are also the founders of GovLab. And seeing the city as a commons is about seeing the city as a collaborative shared space. And it's really about engaging people also in the managing of resources, in the ownership of resources, not just buildings and neighborhoods, but also infrastructure and digital assets. So that requires a fundamental rethink of how we view the city and how we think about how we organize ourselves for change. This is an example of, in Montreal, a church where we supported a small equity investment. It's being now reused. It's the impact hub for Montreal. It's a co-working space. It's also an event space. Obviously, there are hundreds and hundreds of churches across the country which are in similar need of addressing and similar opportunities for. So I want to provide one example from Montreal. This is called Transitory Laboratory, and it's one of the most successful prototypes that we've actually had the opportunity to be a part of. So it's a partnership of our foundation, McConnell, with the City of Montreal, and with two social enterprises, Entremise and La Maison de l'Innovation Sociale, the Social Innovation House in Montreal. And it's really about connecting people without spaces to spaces without people. So we worked with the city. The city has actually put into its Heritage Action Plan a policy that it will provide municipally owned vacant buildings for community serving needs. Seems like a simple idea, but as many of you will know, especially if you work in city government, it's really difficult, and that raises all kinds of questions, all kinds of regulatory barriers around that, and so on. But we managed to do it. We opened the first transitory laboratory hub, which is also the Future Cities hub for Montreal, here back in the spring, and it's hosting about 25 micro-social entrepreneurs. We also filled a market niche where there wasn't enough collaborative co-working space, particularly at very low cost, for micro makers as well as micro-social entrepreneurs, artists, and others. And our mayor, Valérie Plante, is in the center launching it back in March. So just to give you a short context of future cities, so the bubble at the bottom is what we envision right now with this new initiative, Future Cities Canada. So far, there are 2 hubs. There's a hub in Montreal, and there's a hub which will open next week in Toronto at the Future Cities Summit at the Evergreen Brickworks being held there next week. The Future City Center there will be launched. That's actually the background photo is the Brickworks. And we imagine, though, collaborating with a number of hubs, existing and potentially new hubs across the country. So stay tuned for more on that. And Future Cities was really designed to provide, in some ways, what both Ethan and Indy were referring to, that how we organize ourselves, how we govern ourselves, we have to actually really raise our game in order to rise to the challenges that we're facing. And so we designed Future Cities as a collaborative infrastructure to try to address our challenges differently at a different scale. And the 4 areas of innovation that we're focused on to start with are the ones at the top: participation, governance, infrastructure, and capital innovation. So I want to share just two examples of initiatives or movements, what are becoming movements around the world that inspire me and that I feel like we have a huge opportunity to build on, to adapt for context here and to build on. This one is Fab City, and Fab City grew out of Barcelona, but there are actually now 28 cities in the network, and Fab City is really based on the idea that, and the aspiration and expectation that in 35 years, cities should learn to, should become making cities and actually produce all that they consume. So, and actually the International Fab City Conference, by the way, is coming to Canada. It will be in Montreal in 2020. There are no Canadian cities yet signed up to this movement, so maybe Halifax could be the first. And then the other one is Participatory City. And Participatory City is in London. And I'm going to start a video in just a minute. I'm going to show you a couple of minutes of a video to describe what it is. What I find super compelling about it is that so many of us, so much of what Ethan described, what Sophia does, what you do here in Halifax, is actually this, but this is packaged, shared in a way that builds new narratives of possibility, but also it's done in a massive collaborative way at the neighborhood scale that has huge opportunity for systems change and for scaling, not just across a city, but actually in other cities. So it's really about a movement. So let's have a look at this video for a couple minutes to get a flare. you can find the full video if you want to see more, and lots of publications, lots of the research behind it. In fact, a book just came out this week, a report of the first year of this in a borough in London. Just came out Friday, and I should mention the founder of Participatory City, her name is Tessie Britton. She'll be in Canada for 2 weeks, next week and the week after. So she'll be for 1 week with us in Toronto at the Future City Summit, and then the following week she'll be with us in Montreal. I'd love to get her to Halifax sometime if there's interest, but in the meantime, if any of you are able to come to Montreal or Toronto in the next couple weeks, you are most welcome. So for me, part of, as I said, part of the innovation is around scaling this, but it's also the organization of it. This is an example of how already there are groups in Montreal. This is Participatory City, so one of our outstanding, what I consider to be a world-class placemaking group in Montreal called La Pépinière is organizing Participatory City in Montreal and trying to structure it around, this is again one of the ideas that's inspiring me, the idea of creating free zones in neighborhoods around the city. And the idea of these free zones is that people would have an opportunity to prototype experiments that might be outside the usual rules of city government, so they might be outside regulatory guidelines, but at the same time there could be an opportunity for excellent data collection, for monitoring, data collection in all kinds of ways, quantitative, qualitative, and so on, in order to gauge what difference these experiments are making and then what is ripe for actual regulatory change or scaling in other places. Oops. Okay, so this is, don't worry about the little bits, but the point of this is that in innovating how we organize ourselves, we're finding increasingly that the way our organizations and the way our institutions are structured are actually stifling. So even though there are so many great innovators and entrepreneurs within organizations and institutions, it's very hard, as so many of you will know, to make change. And so we're finding that working in ecosystems with supporting platforms can actually be a much more effective way to reach the kind of change we need. And I want to say something about ecosystem working and what we're finding. And that is that operating, India was talking about 3 or 4 levels of change or horizons of change in terms of governance. What we're finding is that within ecosystems, it's absolutely essential. I don't want to be discouraging to people that we only have to be thinking, 100 years ahead, because I know for some people that takes away a sense of agency. So we need projects and programs which are demonstrating what is possible, but we actually need that, and that's Horizon 1. But we actually need so much more than that. We need to be testing, we need to be pushing up against our rules, and we need to be imagining what's possible way ahead in the future and how we need to change our systems and structures in order to get there. So within ecosystems of change, all 3 of those horizons need to be recognized. So I just have a couple more minutes, and in the last few minutes, I want to introduce an idea which I think can really help us to address so many of the challenges that we're facing and really help us to rise to the scale of the challenge by thinking differently and then hopefully acting together differently. And the idea is around 7-generation thinking and 7-generation cities. As most of you will know, in Aboriginal culture, when any time that something is planned for or thought about in any sort of process, you wouldn't begin to consider until you thought about what happened 7 generations ago, and then what was possible for 7 generations into the future. So it's just a way of thinking. It's unthinkable to do otherwise. Well, from a global perspective, if we think about 7 generations ago, the world population was right around 1 billion people. Okay, hugely different, right? We're more than 7 times what we were. It was also an 85% rural population in the world. In this country, it's now the reverse of that. We're about 85% urban. So the world has changed drastically. So if we just those 2 facts, if we think about that 7 generations ago, and then project ahead, It's not enough, actually, just to think about 21st century cities. We should be thinking about 22nd century cities, particularly for Halifax right now. You have huge decisions to make, right? You have the port development, you have other developments which are happening downtown. You have so much that's going on that will have an impact on the city well beyond the time that any of us or our children or our children's children are alive. And so what we decide now is hugely important. Just before I close, I want to play one more video, and this is from the Indigenous Placemaking Council. It's just a minute and a half, but just to get us in the frame of thinking of how Indigenous culture can better infuse our thinking.
What does belonging look like? If nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence in Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
So what city should we expect and aspire to? What would our city look like if we infused Indigenous thinking into it? This is an image of Richard Register's. It's on the cover of his book from 2006, Eco-Cities, Rebuilding Cities in Balance with Nature. His expectation is that San Francisco will evolve over time into the 22nd century to be something like this. This is seeing the city as a regenerative commons. It's seeing the earth, our cities, as dynamic, living, shared systems. So in our great transition, what should we expect of our cities? And the question I want to leave with you in Halifax is, what is the legacy that Halifax wants to leave for the 22nd century and beyond? And what are the decisions to make today in order to get there? Thank you.